Welcome back to another video here on Free Will Photos. Today, we're going to take a look at working with an overcast image. As we start to head into the late fall, early winter season, this is going to be a relatively common scenario that we'll face outdoors. So I want to show you how you can use tools inside of ON1 to get the best or the most out of your images. Now, of course, if you want to pick up ON1, consider using the coupon code FREEWILL10. It'll save you some money on any of the discounted prices that you'll see at the ON1 website throughout the month of November. Now, of course, that is an affiliate coupon, which means I make a commission from everyone who uses it, but it's at no extra cost to you. It's a win-win. Now let's jump into ON1 Photo RAW. All right, so here we are inside of ON1 Photo RAW, and you can see we have an image that's overcast. By the way, you can download this using the link in the description box below if you wanted to follow along. Now, the first thing that I always recommend people do when you have an overcast image in front of you is to just sit and take a look at it. Figure out where your colors are and figure out what is the overall mood and color. Now, this is, again, a very overcast day, and if I were guessing, this is probably somewhere towards the evening where the sun is setting. And this is like probably blue hour on an overcast day. All right. So with that in mind, I know I don't need to move towards warm tones. Now, you could absolutely do that. If I come over here to temperature and push this over to the right, I can get the image looking a little bit warmer, but now it just doesn't quite look right. And if you're going to create the image, to make sense to what you would have seen on the day, you're probably going to want to keep it in a cooler tone or moving the temperature slider more towards the left. Now, before we touch the temperature, we're going to go ahead and start working with developing the overall lighting adjustment. Now, one of my favorite ways that I'm still trying to figure out the best method of doing this, one of my favorite ways of doing this, though, is working with light by itself. And the way that I do that is I just remove all of the color from the image by subtracting the saturation all the way down to -100. This now gives me a black and white image, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to see the brightest areas and the darkest areas. And now I can pay attention to my histogram, and you can also hold down the J key as you start to maneuver the light in the develop module, by the way. I haven't jumped over to local or effects yet, but if I'm holding down the J key, the first place that I like to start is with my shadows, at least on overcast photos, because the light is already pretty dim on an overcast day. So I want to start with the base of where I want the darkest thing to be in my image in the shadowed areas. So what I'm going to do is hold down the J key, and I'm just going to pull my shadows down until I feel like they're right about right. And there's no right or wrong answer here for this image. I think that -18 works the best. So if I hold the backslash key, turning it off and on, and it's kind of hard to see with the color detail coming back, but what I'm doing is I'm really just looking at the change in the tonal range, right? The more you do this, the easier it becomes to see it. I wish that there was a easier way for me to like really show how that works out. But I'm keeping the, we're going to keep moving along. So now that I have my shadows set the way that I think they ought to be, the next place that I need to work on is my highlights. So I need to move my brightest point in the image a little bit, so that way I have a pretty good dynamic range, right? Now, holding down the J key, I'm going to pay attention to my histogram as I pull up on my highlights. This far right side means that I would be clipping, and I just want to see how close I can get to that without clipping. So the first thing I could do is just pull this all the way up until I see red, and I'm not even looking at my histogram right now. I was just pulling on that until I see the little red indicators coming into the sky. Now, I don't plan to print this, so this isn't really that big of an issue. So on your image, if you find, and you don't plan on printing this, by the way, if you find that the adjustment of plus 94 on the highlights is going to give you the look that you want on your image, then by all means, go for it. But for me, what I want to do is try and preserve my dynamic range in a printable range. So that way I know where I am when I start moving into local and effects, because I may push it over the top there. And that's where I want to be a little bit more creative and artistic, if that makes sense. So I'll just go ahead and pull this back down, and I'm going to probably leave it around positive 47. And I think that that works out for my shadows and my highlights. So I have my brightest and my darkest points in the image. So now I get to do what once upon a time used to be called fill light, which just means you're filling in the rest of the image to help get your exposure where you want it to be. And you can either, and in ON1, that's the midtones, by the way. So I can either pull this to the right, and you'll notice that my middle tones, they start to get a little washed out. And for me, that just doesn't quite make sense for an overcast photo. So I'm going to go the opposite direction, and you don't have to go far. Little tweaks really do make a huge difference. So I think negative 13 might actually give me really good contrast, at least for my base image. Now, speaking of contrast, there's a few ways that you can manipulate contrast in the Develop tab. The first way is with the obvious tab or slider called Contrast. You can just pull this over to the right, and it's going to kind of figure itself out and make things darker and brighter. And you can notice how that's impacting the histogram. If I hold down the J key, you can see the more I pull this to the right, the more I blow out the darkest areas in my image. That's the first method. The second method is where you get a little bit more finite control, and that's by using the blacks and the whites. So sometimes it helps to start with the blacks and the whites and then move into highlights, midtone, shadows. But as I mentioned at the start of this particular lesson, I'm still experimenting because I'd like to change the way that I work just to see what I can get out of my edits. All right. But keeping a relatively consistent workflow. So with that being said, I'm going to hold down my J key, and I'm going to grab my black slider. Now, what the black slider does is it only moves the very, very dark portions of your image, or the pixels that are represented in your image. It only moves those pixels. So you'll notice as I pull my black slider to the left to darken things, only that far left side of the histogram actually starts to move. And the beauty of that is, unlike the contrast slider, where it moves both the brightest areas of your image and the darkest areas away from each other or closer to the maximum capacity that they can go, the blacks only work with the blacks. So that allows me to independently select where I want my whites and my blacks in the image to really sit on the histogram. So lots of control with the white and black points. So now I'm just going to go ahead and start working with my whites. And again, I'm not overly concerned about losing information up here. I can bring that back with a local adjustment if it does start to turn into a bigger issue. For me, what I want to see is more definition really along this building here, which is the brightest building, and then get a nice little outline across the top portion of this pier area. So I'm going to hold down the J key, and I'm just going to pull this, and I think that that looks pretty good. And I'm starting to lose information in this building over here. So I want to back that off. But again, I'm not printing this. This is just one of those images that I'm experimenting with, and I would probably be perfectly fine with publishing this on Instagram or wherever I wanted to put it. So I now have good contrast and good lighting, at least for the global edit. And now it's time to reintroduce the color in my image. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the saturation slider here. And I just like to pull this up slowly because I like to watch my image come back to life with color. Because sometimes if I stop right here at -31, I actually really like the way that this image looks. In fact, I would even consider this to be a completed image. So sometimes you can completely edit globally and be done. And, you don't have to go into local and effects. It's great that On1 gives us that flexibility, but don't be intimidated that you have to go and use those tools just because they're there, right? On1 is a workspace for us to create how we want to, and it gives us some more flexibility to edit more, I guess, precisely, if you will. But global edits work all the same. And so here's the before, and here's the after. This looks really film-like. Now, the one tweak that I would probably make if I were stopping here is I would just pull down on the temperature slider ever so slightly. And for me, that shift towards blue really makes this overall image really stand out. Now, some people may not really care for this pier being so dark because sometimes we're told, well, you need to brighten things up if they're too dark. But really, dark and light is relative to what the heck you even care to share in the image. And for me, I think that having this pier dark gives it just enough mystery that it brings people's eyes to it, and you can kind of navigate it with your eyes. You can see that there's a railing, some benches, and if you have an eagle eye, you can see that there's a person right there. But it doesn't have to be the star of the show because, in my opinion, I think that this is more of a scene setting image. There is no true star, at least in my opinion. You may argue that it's the boat, but this is so dark that I wouldn't even make that my main subject. So, but a lot of things really are pointing towards this building over here, which I have literally no clue what that building is. If you know what building this is and where this location is, then please leave it in the comment section below, because that would be very interesting and cool to know. But I digress. With all that being said, this would be my base edit, and now it's time to go and start working a little bit more intimately with the image, if you will. So the next step that I would jump into is the local tab. Now, again, holding down the J key, you can see I'm losing some of that information in the sky. So I'm just going to take a brush and I'm going to take a minus highlight slide or whatever adjustment here. And in fact, let me just turn on these clipping indicators and I'm just going to paint this away just like that. And I don't have to get rid of all of it. I just want to get rid of as much of it as I can. And that way I don't have to worry about it as I start to push this image a little bit further. All right. So maybe just pull that back right there. Okay. So now that I have all of my highlights recovered and I'm still within the dynamic range without losing any information, technically I could print this image and it would be just fine. But now it's time to go a step further. All right, so the next step that I want to do here is separate the background from the foreground just a little bit more and really lean into that blue temperature adjustment. So to do that, I'm going to jump over to Effects. I'm going to add a filter, and then I'm going to select the depth lighting. Now, this is a Photo RAW 2026 filter. If you're on an older version of ON1, you're not going to have this filter. But there is a way to do it with a luminosity mask. I'll showcase that in another video. With that being said, what I'm going to do is go ahead and hold down the Option key, and I'm going to click and drag this depth slider. Anything that is highlighted in white is going to be my foreground, and anything that's highlighted, or I guess not highlighted, is going to be my background. And then obviously anything that's a shade of gray is going to be partially selected essentially, but towards the foreground. And This is a mask that is built into the filter. This is not the actual filter mask. All right. I want to be very clear on that because that can be a little confusing. But nonetheless, holding down the option key, clicking and dragging on the depth slider allows me to select different areas. So again, I want to select just that front portion. So this pier and the ship over here are good to be selected. And then all I'm going to do is take the background and increase the visibility of it or the luminosity of it. The reason is the further away things are from us, the less saturated and typically the brighter they are. It's called atmospheric haze, even though this is probably not as far as like what you would perceive in, just a wide open landscape image, but you can still play to that end. Now, the idea here is not to go like crazy overboard. I think that this is too much. It's all about subtlety, all right? Things that are done subtly are going to really help with the enhancement of the overall image. Now, the next thing that I would do, if I really wanted to, I could pull the foreground in the opposite direction because things that are typically closer to the camera are darker and a little bit more saturated. So I can just pull down and you can see that that just really brings some depth into the image. I actually like that. And you do have to pull a little aggressively on these sliders. So if you feel like, I'm pulling this almost to the end and it's just now starting to get where I want it to be, well, that's kind of the reality of it. But here's what you can do to kind of play around with it to get a little bit more kick out of it. If you click the 3-line menu and then click on blending, and then you expand your blending properties, we're going to go ahead and move this over to overlay or soft light. Either one is going to work out just fine. And you'll notice now this is like intense, right? This is intense overall. So what I want to do is just pull down on the opacity. I'll pull it all the way down and then just fade it into my image to probably somewhere around here. Looks about right. Turning it off and on, maybe even increase the background there just a bit. And this is just helping with pulling out a little bit more interest and making the image look a little bit more dimensioned or dynamic. That's the word. All right. Now, the last thing that I'll do with this particular tool is I will grab the background and I'm just going to go ahead and pull that towards the blue. And that's just going to help to make that background look a little bit more cooler. All right. And oh, you know what? I changed the blend mode. So these aren't doing anything. No worries. I'll show you how to work with that. So now that we have our lighting effect the way that we need it, let's go ahead and hit add filter. And then we're going to come over to color enhancer. Now, the reason why I use the color enhancer is specifically for the tools that are underneath color. I get temperature, tint, saturation, and vibrance, and I can apply that selectively over the image. And if I wanted to, I could also apply a color range, but we're not going to worry about that for today. We're just going to stay in effects because technically I could also do this, what I'm about to do, inside of local. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and click on my layer mask and I'm going to create a depth mask. Now, the difference between the depth lighting and any other masking tool, if you want to use the depth masking, then you need to create an actual effect mask like I did. So if I press the letter O, now I am looking at the effect mask over here inside of the color enhancer. Now I have the depth mask layer, not to be confused with actual layers. The depth mask layer allows me to control the distance. So I'm just going to pull this until I think it's getting a good separation of what I think is the foreground. And I think that that's good. Now, obviously, I want the opposite of this because I want to make the background a little bit more blue. What I'm going to do is click the three line menu, and then I'm just going to hit, and let me rephrase. What I'm going to do is click the three line menu on the mask layer for the depth here, and then I'm going to click invert. And that has now selected everything in the background, minus a little bit of that building, but I now have a good selection, the opposite of what I was working with. I'll press the letter O, and this allows me to move my temperature slider. I'm just going to exaggerate it so you can really see it. And then I can just pull this back up until I believe it fades in quite naturally overall. So it's always good to turn off your effects and turn them back on, and you can see exactly what it's doing to the image. Now, of course, if it is too strong, you can use the opacity, and that could work out pretty well. Another technique that you can do, I know I'm throwing a lot out in this particular video, but hopefully it's finding value. And if it is, smash that like button. And, if you're new here, subscribe. With that being said, I'm going to hit the three line menu again on the color enhancer so I can go to my blend modes. And then I'm going to select inside of the blend mode for the color enhancer this time. I'm going to select color. And what that does is it protects any of the lighting arrangements or adjustments that I've already created. And this only takes care of adding in or subtracting color. Now, what's cool about this, remember we created that depth mask. So now what I can do is come over here to my saturation. Remember I mentioned earlier, things that are further away from the camera are usually less saturated. So since this is one of those overcast days, I'm just going to go ahead and grab the saturation tool or slider, and I'm going to pull it all the way down. And then I'm just going to drag it up ever so slightly until I feel like there's a good blend of desaturation in the background compared to what I have in the foreground. So if I turn this adjustment off and turn it back on, you can see things are a little bit more blue back there, as well as a little less saturated than the foreground. And who knows, maybe I'll pull this saturation even further, just so that way it's really separating things. And it's very, very subtle. Again, subtle matters a lot when it comes to editing realistic photos, and not overdoing it. So those are the two effects that we have so far. Let's take a look at the before and take a look at the after. Now, what I'm noticing is I'm losing some of the color in the boat here, especially those red cells, which I think would really help to pull things in for this particular image. So I'm going to use a local adjustment to help recover what's going on with those cells, because I think the thing that's getting them, let me see, it's not the depth lighting, and it's definitely not this color enhancer. So it's probably something over here in the tone and color section. And most likely it's that adjustment that we made earlier with the temperature. So I need to go and do the opposite of that in the local adjustment. So I'm going to go to local. I'm going to add new, and this time I'm going to add a quick mask AI brush, and we'll just add that in. And then I'm going to hover over these cells, and it's okay if I select a little bit more than just the cells. This doesn't have to be the most precise. It just needs to be good enough, right? So I'm going to come over here to the blue check mark to commit that mask into those areas. And then I'm just going to scroll down here and see if increasing the temperature will bring back some of that red. And if it doesn't, then that's okay, because we'll just come over to the exposure as well and maybe contrast it a bit. Let's open up some of those shadows, and we will add some vibrance to it, and then maybe saturate it So we get that red color coming back in those cells. Now, I may have overdone it just a bit here, not gonna lie, but that's okay because I have my friend, the opacity slider. This really is my friend. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this down and then drag it up until I start to get the look that I was going for with those cells. Maybe somewhere around here is pretty good. Now, if I wanted to and I had more time, I could definitely zoom in on this cell and paint that little bottom section so that way the color comes back in there. But I'm not going to worry about that for today. Just know that we did recover some of that color and I think it's looking pretty good. It actually may be a little too punchy. So let's just go ahead and pull that back because everything needs to be correct in balance. All right, that's just my opinion. Things should be correct and balanced. So we're good to go. And of course, I could rename this. I'm not going to. So here's the before where we started, and here's the after where we are right now. Of course, I could go a lot further. I could add in a color grade to this, but the real takeaway, at least my hope in, working with overcast images is to work with what you got. Now, was this image a little bit warmer to begin with? Absolutely. But was the warmth actually doing this photo any justice? Not in my opinion. I think that the blue contrasted look, it does look the best overall for this particular photo. And this is just my own editing style. So take this, apply it to your images, and then tweak it, make it your own. That's the whole goal of why I teach what I do and explain why I'm using the tools that I do. And consequently, that makes my videos just a little bit longer than everyone else's. But hopefully it's of value because that's my main goal, is to help people understand how to use the software and grab tools that are helpful. So with that being said, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on editing overcast photos? What are some of your tips, tricks, techniques that you would be willing to share with the community? Leave it in the comments section below. If you got questions about this technique or anything else inside of ON1, you can also leave that in the comment section below. If you want to learn how to use the software, consider signing up for a training call. A link for that can be found in the description box, not the comment section. Until next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.